People often ask me what are the most important things to consider when we're making the transition from institutional to community-based services. And so I've got a number of tips here or hints that I always keep in mind whenever I'm managing a process of change, and I hope that they'll be of some use to you. The first and the most important thing to remember is do no harm. Whatever intervention we are going to make for children, we need to make sure that we have the right expertise, resources and capacity to do it right so that children will not be harmed in the process. Otherwise, don't do it. The second is not to judge families. Very often, people see children in institutions and imagine that they are there because families are bad or neglectful or abusive of their children. My experience in most countries has been that most families love and want their children, but really feel that they have run out of options and that the best thing they could do for their child is give them up to the institution. So it's important that we don't judge them and that we first of all find out what the situation of the family is and why the child came into the institution in the first place. Because in many, many cases, if we support parents, children will go home and will be looked after very, very well and develop to their full potential. The third key point is not to judge the personnel. I've visited hundreds of institutions over the past 2 decades in many, many countries, and I must say that I've met a handful of people who are extremely dangerous to children and should actually be behind bars. But most of the personnel working in institutions are really good people in a bad situation. They are trying their best, and they are not purposefully neglectful of children. So it's really important that we don't judge them and that we see them, instead of a focus of resistance to the deinstitutionalisation process, we see them as a resource, because they are the very people who can be great foster parents, great family support workers or teachers in inclusive schools or community workers. And so if we support the personnel and empower them from the beginning, they become one of the major vehicles for change rather than resistance. Number 6. Focusing on the building is a common trap. When planning the transition from institutional to community-based services, often one of the first things that people do is to think about how can we reuse the building. It's the wrong approach. We need to start thinking first of all about what services are needed and therefore where is the best place to locate them. But because people think the other way round, quite often they make an inappropriate reuse of the building, such as setting up an institution for adults with disabilities or for older people, or locating a service inappropriately far away from the community that needs to benefit from it. This is a really poor use of resources and ends up with the wrong services in the wrong place. Number 7, prepare the children to move from the institution to their new placements. Any move for a child is scary, but for a child who's been in an institution for a long time, moving them to somewhere completely unfamiliar can be absolutely terrifying and traumatic. For children with disabilities who've been in the institution for a long time, this trauma can be extremely devastating and has at times resulted in death. So it's really important that we put in place preparation programs and we make sure that every child is ready to move from the institution and feeling positive about the move before it takes place. This then will form the basis for a good, successful outcome in a community-based family placement. Number 8, ending institutionalisation should be seen as an investment in children. The research that we have done and many others have done proves that for most children, placements in family care are much, much less expensive than in an institution. But when a government finds out that this is the case, they really shouldn't see the deinstitutionalisation process as a cost-cutting opportunity. Instead, this should be about taking those resources, ring-fencing them, and transferring them across to the community-based services, because this is a real opportunity for governments to use that money better and to reach out to up to 10 times as many vulnerable children in the community as they were providing services for in the institution. Number 9, invest in change management. The process of deinstitutionalisation is actually a huge exercise in change management, and if we don't have the right resources in place, something will go wrong and somewhere a child will get hurt. So when we're planning deinstitutionalisation, make sure we're putting in place the right team with the right skills and enough capacity to manage every aspect of the process and ensure that children are protected throughout. Number 10, invest in communication. There is massive resistance to deinstitutionalisation and to closing institutions and setting up community-based services. And that resistance comes from fear, and those fears are usually based on myths and misunderstanding. So it's really important from day one to have a great communication strategy, because if we put this in place and we ensure that all of the people involved receive the right messages at the right time, this will dramatically reduce the resistance and the fear involved. But often when planning deinstitutionalisation, people considerably underestimate the resources that are needed to ensure good communications throughout. So I would recommend strongly that whenever planning deinstitutionalisation, we make sure there's enough capacity and the right expertise to put in place a good communication strategy. This will result in a better quality and a more effective and a more efficient deinstitutionalisation process. Finally, at every step in the deinstitutionalisation process, ask yourself the question, in whose interests are we making this decision? If you can truthfully answer that this is in the best interests of children, then proceed. But if you think in any way that a decision is being made to appease resistant adults, then it is likely to result in mistakes that could harm children, and so you need to rethink your priorities.